sit down, climb back together. We had originally planned this that I was going to ask a few questions of Nancy and Lorraine, and they would give answers, and then we'd open it to everybody else. We decided to switch it up a little bit so we can involve you during that conversation. So we're going to do a format of, I'll ask a question, they'll give an answer, and then we're going to throw it out to you if you have anything you'd like to add in and form in on that sort of question topic before we move to the next one. So we can keep people more engaged in that.
Yes, and we don't have all the answers. We're hoping you have even more, and we can all learn.
So if people are ready, and I know there's a few of the folks getting a cup of tea and coming back in. Our first question. Using a gender transformative and intersectional approach is about seeing the connections between the individual and the structural, and recognizing that transformative change has to happen at both levels. Can you give us an example of when your gender transformative work has supported structural approaches that aim to dismantle other systems of oppression and discrimination alongside gender?
Wow. I think we're going to address this by talking about a few of the projects we've been engaged in over the years. And some are current, some are past, but it's an interesting question that allows us to reflect. I think there's a project that we're involved in at the moment with a very, very large pan-Canadian social service organization, where we're trying to introduce a massive organizational change. The problem in it, though, that we've come up against is that it's extremely hierarchical in its structure. And it has long tradition of being that, and that's still very present, even though the goals of the organization are very progressive. And it's known as a very progressive organization. So to cut a long story short, one of the things that we've been doing within this overarching organizational change project is to actually engage with the clients or participants, as they're called in this case, of the organization, and there are thousands of them. It's a massive organization. Engage with a subsection of those and talk to them about how they can become part of the change. And a long story short, it's really addressing democracy and how democracy is enacted in a big, big organization. So you could translate that example into any big institution, any societal institution that may have a progressive goal but a very traditional structure. And how do you actually engage the people who are to be the beneficiaries of that organization in, from their point, helping them to address their own agency, to acquire power, to break down some of the hierarchies, to get a voice in the organization, to get a place, to be able to affect it. And some of these clients and participants are permanent with this organization. In other words, they're living in this case, supportive housing, and they'll be there for a very long time, if not forever. So it really does matter to them how the organization works. They're not just coming in for service and leaving. So addressing democratic ideals within what is already a very gender progressive organization that would characterize itself as gender transformative to the nth degree, we're now addressing democracy.
And what were you asked to come in to do?
We were asked to come in to facilitate with a large organizational change to bring in what we call trauma-informed practice in this case. So they're already gender transformative. They wanted to be trauma-informed because a lot of their clientele have experienced trauma in a variety of ways, and it's impacting their programming. So that was what we were doing. And it's a 4-year project, so there's plenty of time to ruminate. And as it turns out, we're ruminating a lot about democracy and how gender transformative progressive organization that is also wanting to be trauma informed, that also has extremely progressive goals in terms of gender equality, is now having to self-reflect about their internal democracy.
So power, agency, hierarchy,
Yep.
who gets to have a voice,
Yeah.
how that voice is heard.
Who sets the policies? Yeah.
And, you know, I think it's an example of the fact that we really believe that you do gender transformative work in whatever project you're asked to do, right? So you locate yourself wherever. We've got like many projects we could discuss. One of the ones that I led was in the north of Canada on Baffin Island, if any of you know where that is. And the idea behind the project was that we were to look at the issues around mental health needs and homelessness amongst women in the north, right? And it was a really interesting project, and we invited the women within services in the north to think about how, you know, how everything fit together for them. And it was interesting because they created a kind of a picture for us in interviews of vicious cycles of homelessness, poverty, violence against women, and all these, you know, issues going together. And but the interesting thing for us was that they not only named how these things became a vicious cycle, but they also named all the points where they saw that could change. Like, they were very thoughtful about where's the change in it. And one of the things that I really liked was some of the women within who were temporarily housed in what do they call them here, shelters? Refuges. Were identifying the fact that when they went into there, they couldn't earn money because the social services was paying for them to be in the shelter, and they were identifying how important it was for them to be able to make money, well, and progress towards. So they were talking about capitalism in the context of, you know, having experienced violence, living with mental health issues and homelessness. And I just thought it was very interesting how they were able to really think about the structural pieces. And one of the ones they named was, we also have the problem not only of the fact we can't make money, but we also have the fact that the reason we're here is because our boyfriend punched a hole in the wall in the place we were living when they were hurting us. And because the place was in our name, we lost our damage deposit, and we can't get another place until we pay that off, but we also can't work. And so, you know, they were very clearly saying that you need to change the policy around us being able to not be responsible for men's violence and to be able to earn money and get back and move forward as in an empowering way. So I just think it's interesting because they saw the structural need that could make a difference, rather than saying we need counseling or, you know, that kind of piece of it. So we've got like 10 other projects we could talk about, but maybe we'll think about the structural within other people's work.
Does anyone have anything they want to add on that? Yes, no.
I want to ask a question actually about that organisation you speak about, Lorraine. Because if they are a gender transformative organisation, I'm kind of making an assumption that they engage in feminist leadership practices. Would that be true?
Yeah.
And we've been talking about that at work and how that engages intersects with kind of distributed leadership. And I'm wondering what the barriers are, I suppose, when you are doing feminist leadership. Why doesn't it naturally lead to that distributed leadership or democratic model? What stops it?
And that is the exact question that we're addressing. Because we would have expected that to be a much easier slide that would have in fact incorporated not only the voices of the clients, but also the voices of all of the other workers in the organization. And that hasn't happened. And it seems to be historical in this case. It's a 150-year-old organization, and I think that matters. So the progressive ideas about gender transformative, feminist ideals, gender equality, they're an advocacy organization as well. They have emerged over that 150 years. But the structure of decision-making hasn't. And I think it's really, this points us in some ways to the indicator development discussion as well, because you have to drill down and say, what exactly is it here that's the hurdle or the thing that needs changing? And it is, as you say, a distributed model that would actually distribute decision-making, distribute authority, distribute agency, distribute space for voice to come through, distribute in different ways, different evaluation measures. And it's so interesting. I know we're not here to talk about trauma-informed practice, but trauma-informed practice is an organizational commitment. Same way gender transformative practice is an organizational commitment. And the principles overlap a lot in that within trauma-informed practice, we would expect that there be some democratization occur, and that we would expect that there would be some sense that everyone's affected by everything in the organization. And so there's some leveling to take place. So it's doubly interesting for us to see that there's this resistance, I would have to say, to distributing decision-making, or even input, distributing input to policy development. And it's so interesting because I've worked a lot with the clients in this organization, and there is, not surprising to any of you, I would hope, an enormous reserve of interest, skill, desire to be part of it. And it's untapped. So I think when we think about indicators, we have to drill down and get very specific. Who makes decisions? How is that shared? How do we measure that? What are the processes for engaging in policy change in a place or in a project? These are pretty specific sometimes and very context specific as well, but I think it matters. I'm giving you an example of a large organization in a big city in Canada, but you could apply this to a small project in Uganda. I think you would have the same questions. And how do you get at what, in essence, to me, is a reflection of tradition and traditional approaches that, you can call whatever you want, but they're hierarchical.
In the masterclass, we bring in some of that conversation about ask those questions about who is making decisions and whose voice is being heard. And we also bring that into thinking around intersectionality, because even when we can think we're being incredibly progressive and inclusive in a gender transformative way, we may still just be thinking from our own individual personal perspective, because we always start there. And part of thinking intersectionally is thinking about the perspectives that you do not already hold and have, and what other information that you could bring into that picture. So bringing intersectionality and bringing questions that will help build an intersectional practice is also helping the gender transformative, so you're not just sort of narrowing it in your scope of what your understanding of gender transformative is.
That's right.
Making sure that there's a bit of more of a democratization in how decisions are made, even at a project level.
And I think the example also addresses discomfort, with change, even when you have a progressive organization. At the end of the day, to make change, people have to change, and that's not always welcome. So, there is that sort of very individual response as well.
And it's kind of interesting too, one of the other projects we've just currently working on is helping the child welfare system in our province, state, whatever, to become trauma-informed. And they invited us to do that. And in the course of that, of course, we talked to them about race and gender as a key elements of bringing forth a trauma-informed system of care. And it's very interesting because they can think about, in terms of intersectional ideas, they can think about age and the different ages of kids and the different responses needed. And they can think about race, or specifically around Indigenous work. They're doing some wonderful work around not apprehending as many Indigenous kids, etc. But the gender piece is so hard for them to grapple with, right? And it's really an interesting dilemma where, from the individual to the structural, we're having the biggest challenge around the gendered nature of trauma and the needed responses at both the individual practitioner level, which is where they wanted us to stay, kind of, and how do social workers interact with kids and families in a trauma-informed way, whereas we're trying to say to them, excuse me, but that is the smallest piece of it in our minds. It's about workers, it's about leadership, it's about, these structural determinants of health that you need to weave into your analysis and your approach. So, that is one of the biggest structural challenges I think we're facing right now, is with a system like that is so challenged to work in a gender transformative way.
So you can really build in whatever it might be the in, or what we've sort of brought in, or the project that's doing, but finding out what are the other structures or systems that maybe have oppression. There might be structures that might be supportive or empowering the voice, sort of democratic structures, and where we can make that work be. And that's interesting to find where we might be ready to have some conversations, like we're ready to think about race, or we're ready to think about across the lifespan, or ages, we can think this way, but where are there barriers, where is there?
Well, and that's why I was laughing this morning when you raised the patriarchy question, because we'll talk capitalism any old day, we'll talk racism any old day, but somehow patriarchy is a harder term, right? Yeah. It's one we don't want to talk about. And I feel like that's exactly what's going on in this child welfare system,
Yeah.
So where all of this can be entryways to have other conversations and keep pushing sort of further.
Yeah, and to their credit, they asked a center of excellence in women's health to help them. So you got to like them for that.
Having a gender conversation.
Well, I think the bottom line, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, is that wherever we go, we do this work, this GT work. And I'm supposing that many of you do that too, because once you have that critical process going in your head, you can't get rid of it, for one thing. And so you see the world differently. So in all of the various projects or various organizations you may be working in, you're going to bring that lens. And I think that's great, because that's one of the ways in which we spread this as a movement too.
And that's where I like that one man can kind of approach, right? Of what each man tells 10 others, and it spreads through that kind of consciousness raising and involvement, engagement process.
I like that, bringing up the consciousness raising.
Yeah.
Giving us the old tools that we relied on so heavily, bring them back in on that, be a part of that. So our next question is thinking about gender transformative change as a process, sometimes a long one, and change can seem, and that change, sometimes change that we have can seem really radical at one point in time, can be later seen as maybe only that very first step. For example, maternity leave, getting an organization to hold a position for a woman to be able to go off to have a baby and return back to, and then to get it paid, which is still often
many parts of the world does not happen, but to have a paid leave even for a portion of that time. And then we're expanding out, we think, no, we need to think about paternity leave and parental leave and broader ideas around that. And then how should that be paid and rewarded? And then we also, building on that, we have breastfeeding spaces at work or time off to be able to breastfeeding, which is sort of building around trying to make a space friendly for a new mother return to work, which we also then see an increase in working from home and flexible work policies that often sort of come back into that to make people when they have young children. So these are really gender transformative workplace things that may have started at one point, and now we see, oh, you only offer maternity leave, or it's only this big, and that's not gender transformative. That can be reinforcing of gender roles. So we can see it really differently. Can you give us another example of an ongoing process of gender transformative change that you have witnessed or you've been involved in?
Many. I think the whole area of violence against women is a really good example of this, actually, because it was in 1979, the first book was published on the notion of sexual harassment. And when it was an American author, when she published that book, there was kind of a weird response to it. It was either dismissed as a, what are you talking about? Or people were kind of intrigued, but a little mystified, like how can you kind of conceptualize this thing? Because, you know, this relates to what I was saying earlier about the ocean we swim in. At that time, it was just the ocean. Oh, so somebody put their hand on your back at work in a way that made you feel uncomfortable. So what? That's the way it is. Get over it. If you don't like it that much, get another job. And that was exactly what this author showed at the time, is that when women were sexually harassed, ultimately, the people who moved on were the women. Fast forward to #MeToo. You know, flash forward to Harvey Weinstein and Epstein and Prince Andrew this week, etc. And you have, I mean, that is an amazing continuum in 40 years. I know that sounds like a long time, but it's not actually when you think about the depths of history connected to the patriarchy. And the questions being asked now are about why are we collectively ignoring women's voices? And why are we not, you know, giving women's voices, particularly survivors' voices, equal, if not more credit and credibility than powerful men? That's the conversation we're having now. And in between that has been an entire social movement around recognizing violence against women. I mentioned yesterday in the intro about the fact that we had a Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada in 1970, and of 264 recommendations, not one was about violence issues. So that tells you in 50 years what has happened is an entire revolution.
And then you just had the inquiry into murdered.
That's right.
The Indigenous women.
That's right. And the entire nation taking responsibility for that, quite frankly. Not just about the Indigenous part, but about the processes of racism and sexism that underpin that. So that discussion's been quite deep. And, you know, nobody would have thought that that would occur. And this week, we're reflecting on the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre. For those of you in the violence against women movement, you may know about that event where in 1989, over 20 women were gunned down in a university classroom because they were in engineering school by a man who came in and said, "I hate feminists." And that was a pretty pivotal event. And at the time, it was dismissed as one maniac, I'm quoting, did that. We can't see that as symbolic of anything else. And this week in the press, all the articles about that anniversary are about, we have moved on from that individualistic explanation to that event to something that is much more broad.
and the title of that article in the Globe and Mail, or a major newspaper in Canada, was Violent Misogyny. So we moved from the individual unfortunate man with a mental illness to, a very systemic look. I think the other one that stands out for me that I feel really has shifted over time is this notion of male caregiving and fatherhood. And, I think that you kind of alluded to it with the parental leave and whatever. It's not been our work, but I just notice it a lot as something that's, I think, really promising as a shift in the culture towards honoring fatherhood in new ways that isn't just breadwinner ways, but is actually engaging in caregiving of children and the thoughtfulness that can go around that. And yesterday I showed the image of the smoking reduction program that we have been sort of involved with, the Dads in Gear program, which is about health promotion with men around reducing their smoking, both for themselves but also as fathers, right? And seeing that would never have been done in the past as a motivation for men to reduce or stop their smoking. I just think, from the Marlboro man to the dad quitting smoking for his kids is a really remarkable movement over time that I think deserves applauding.
Anyone?
Questions?
Yeah.
I'm just interested in that topic around sexual harassment at work, which is quite forefront of people's minds here in Australia at the moment. There's a lot of attention around the issue. And I want to acknowledge that things have progressed significantly since 1979. But that also we're going through this period where there is an enormous amount of backlash, and where women speaking out about sexual harassment at work, it's still predominantly the woman who will leave their job. A lot of these cases don't go to prosecution.
Yeah.
They're lucky if they settle outside of court. Women can lose, their whole prospect for future career advancement. And there's still this narrative around, is it really that bad? I mean, you publicly shame a man and now he's going to lose his job, and what impact will that have on the family? So I think there's been a cultural move in a positive direction, much more acceptance around changing roles of men in the caregiver role here. But I'm not sure around this issue around sexual harassment, that cultural shift has been quite the same. I think there's increased awareness, but there's also still this sense of entitlement. Is it really that bad? And what do we do about the backlash and making that cultural shift that is necessary?
One of the places in Canada where we've seen a bit of change is the amount of sexual harassment in our national police force called the RCMP. And they have really taken it in the ear by women who've, said just their lives have been intolerable in the context of that as police officers. And one of the things I thought was really kind of interesting is most recently they made a woman the head of the RCMP in Canada. The first woman. I mean, it was shocking. And, she looks like a little ball of energy who's going to, really take them to the wall. And, so I agree with you that meanwhile in the States, this woman who testified about, against the Supreme Court appointment of Kavanaugh, just really, back in the 70s kind of approach, right? The way she was treated and the results. So I think we have both things going on, and it's really important to be naming them both and trying to find a place of linking up that.
I think your example is interesting because I've said a few times in talking to people about GT work that and equality in general, gender equity in general, is that we're winning and losing at the same time. And You know, I guess that just indicates the various threads in the tapestry that we have to weave together to get to that end point that we all want. And sometimes some of them get broken. And, you know, events intervene with this too. You know, there could be a particular high-profile event or a particular hearing that happens, and things seem to take a different turn. So it's not always predictable, I guess, these forces of progress, and they're not linear.
Is it about, you know, with parental leave, for example, that advantage is family. So that's something in there, you know, I guess that is an advantage to be able to take parental leave. It's seen as a positive thing now. Whereas sexual harassment cases, you know, changing workplace relations, that's not an advantage for men. You know, that doesn't put them in an advantageous position at work or anywhere else. So is it about the perception of what men will gain out of these changes as opposed to what they will lose? That is.
Well, I think the men and masculinities folks will have things to say about that, but it is about how you conceptualize your power and whether or not you've got more or less after a change comes in. So I think your question is really pertinent. I don't know if you want to comment on how that gets perceived.
No, I think it's something that's definitely grappled with by people in the space. And I know some research, or Michael Flood talks about, does it have to be a zero-sum game that, you know, that men, and I suppose that's where the men will benefit approach comes from, that what are the hooks to show, you know, that men, it's not all just about that they receive privilege, there are impacts, and how can we leverage that?
And the hooks can be risky.
They can be risky.
You have to really choose your hook. And the reality is for everyone to be equitable, some people are going to have to lose a lot more than others. Yeah. And that's the same with decolonisation and all of that kind of stuff. Like, there is some spaces in my life where I will gain when someone else loses, and as far as a white woman, there are some things that I'm going to have to give over to somebody else because that would make it more equitable. And the hooks are dangerous, and that's why the accountability to women has to always sit within that. Mm-hmm. And there's always a power struggle, because also where are women in the solidarity with other women and their stories? Mm. You know, sometimes we don't stand there because, oh God, I want to pay my rent too, and I fight too much elsewhere, I'll let that slip through. Because what we did see with, you know, #MeToo, that's such a great line now, is that other women actually stood with other women. Yeah. Quite publicly and quite ferociously, and then gathered other allies of other men who were ready to stand with them. That to me was the difference in that movement. Yeah. And I think if you're going to take something on within a workplace, I think you need to do your homework and your consensus raising and build that before you take that to the power. Because if you go up there going, hey, shoot me, someone, you know, like, no, it's all bad here. It's too easy to push you aside. I think we don't always work collectively.
No, I think your point's very well taken, and in the book I mentioned that, in my view, the contemporary version of consciousness raising takes place on the internet. It used to be in people's living rooms or
street corner or university campus.
Yeah, and it used to be, you know, on paper or in talk. And now it takes place on the internet. And I think, you know, as much as we rail against some of the negativity about social media and the internet, there's an incredible potential there for spreading the word instantly in some cases and generating collective support.
I think the kids that were at the massacre with Florida,
Parkland.
They were amazing. They were so savvy, and they got so united so quickly together and used strengths. And then when they were seen by everybody, they were on same language. You know, it was almost, you couldn't stop them. And I think that's what we need to do better within workplaces.
Even though they tried to make the young lesbian.
Oh, I know, but you know, where's the minority? We better, like, you know, attack them first, and then, geez.
But I think also, to bring intersectionality back into it, that perhaps the most powerful men in our system do only benefit. But there are many men who don't feel that they have a lot of power. How can we, you know, think about all those other structures and systems that are also impacting a lot of men, really, and show that the system is really benefiting a small group perhaps those men, that small group, will have to lose
The most.
the most.
And I think that's what's interesting to me about the example I've raised for you about moving from the invisibility of all of this to actually focusing on some of the most powerful men in the world right now. So it actually shows that it's not an average guy who's losing in these cases. It's actually a powerful guy or several. And I think that's quite sobering for everyone to see that perhaps these movements can have that effect.
So we are running through on time, but I want to make sure that we have some good discussions in a moment. But I do want to ask about indicators. So thinking in the next step is measuring our gender transformative work. And we know that our gender transformative work is going to be context dependent. And we can't sort of set up a whole checklist to say, how well are we doing it perfectly across everything with indicators across the board, or we don't know how to do that yet, if that's the case. We still want to know how are we doing it? How well are we doing it? So do you have anything you can share with us in your thinking, your work, that could be useful to us around indicators to help us determine what we're doing? Have you developed any? Are you considering doing any of that? Can we merge our monitoring evaluation masterclass with our gender transformative masterclass and do something magical there?
I think that's a great idea, actually. Seriously, because I think that's the way you do merge the work into every domain. And maybe you've hit on the crux of this, that we need to see not evaluation as not a separate thing, but as part of this. So what is GT evaluation? What is GT monitoring? What indicators do we need? I don't think we're there yet at all. Number one, it's context specific. Number two, I think we've got some ideas. And I think a chief one is focusing on processes as well as outcomes, if not instead of outcomes in certain settings. So we'll just hold that, and we'll talk about some examples in a minute. And then I think another one is one I heard this morning is measuring readiness and measuring where you are at the outset, so that you do have some basic before and afters that are not just about the content of what you're doing, but about the population that you're attempting to work with. Because, you know, GT is a big amorphous thing. It's got a lot of different components. Another thing we might just float out there is that yesterday I talked a little bit about gender and breaking it down into its various components, as well as sex, breaking it down into its various components. And I think that is something that we often slide over in this work. We talk about gender transformative, but what are we actually doing? In some cases, we're doing gender norms change. In other cases, we're addressing gender identity and performance of gender and stereotyping. In other cases, we're looking at gender relations and how they could be changed. So I think we need to get way more specific about our indicators too. What are we trying to work on? What part of gender are we trying to work on? What are the subtypes of that? And then start talking about readiness, context, and processes. So, having said nothing, Nancy will take over now and give you some indicators.
Well, I do really agree with that, thinking through the aspects of gender, and you didn't mention the institutional ones, but that's the kind of ones that they most normally would want to see as the shift.
Well, that's your parental leave stuff and your regulations.
Yeah, but I do think getting specific about, are we trying to influence norms or performance or identity or relations? I think that's really, really an important point, the idea of really thinking about what are indicators of improvement in gender relations. And, you know, I think they'll be really complex. There'll be things like the issues around power and control in a whole range of ways, and, you know, from in different countries and different locations that'll look differently. And can women go outside the house without a head gear on or whatever. There's a lot of different ways in which we're seeing that play out at this point in time. So I think that's really important. But the evaluation side of it, I think is really interesting too. And I've been reading some of the traditional, evaluation folks like Michael Quinn Patton, and really noticing how he's moved over the years from outcome evaluation to developmental evaluation and now to principle-focused evaluation. And I think some of that work around principle-focused evaluation could be really helpful to us here, because we are trying to work from principles in some ways. And I think that, there's ways for us to pull in some of those ideas that are being generated in contexts that are not at all interested in gender as far as I can see, but to make them, our own and think through what does that give us here that we could apply our gender transformative thinking to. And so I think it's a really important moment. And the answer to are we preoccupied with it? Yes, we are.
We are, because it matters not just to funding proposals and refunding proposals, but it matters to all of us about whether or not we're going to get any certainty or satisfaction from the work that we're trying to do here. But I would encourage you, there's this spectrum of evaluation, as Nancy's just said, where we might want to influence things like the Worldwide Gender Equality Index by adding something in. But all the way down to the other extreme, where there's an academic in Alberta, in Canada, who goes to various Middle Eastern countries every year. She's of Middle Eastern origin, and she's interested in one indicator, and it's freedom of movement. And her work is fascinating because it's not just an amorphous concept. She measures how many meters from the house a woman can go without accompaniment, guardianship, or a male accompanying person. How many meters? So she can compare, well, it's 200 meters here, and it's 500 here, and in this case, it's nothing. I mean, this is concrete stuff. But this is a really interesting indicator, one would think, of freedom of movement, of freedom of person, as a way in that context to try and transform that particular social context. So, it goes from specific to large. What do we get in the World Bank narrative? What do we get in the WHO narrative? What do we get in the Gender Equality Index narrative? What can we shift there?
So that also makes me think that if we know that our gender transformative work is context specific, and we're looking for indicators, there may be a lot of indicators that exist out there that may be measuring gender equality or other things that you could think might work for your individual project that you could you could bring in. We're working here on being able to measure our prevention of violence against women programs, and with of the monitoring evaluation framework specifically for those kinds of programs around family violence and violence against women, so we can have sort of collective measures together. And where does gender transformative come into that?
Yeah.
Might be some.
And I think one of the things that would be really important is some of the tension that Regina helped us explore a bit this morning around the question of measuring men's engagement and women's engagement and leadership, and the balance between those as we do gender transformative projects, right? And I think there's things in there that I could see being quite measurable in terms of pulling from how other people have looked for engagement in the past, and then rethinking it in the context of gender transformative work. And I think, that's what's so neat about evaluation and measurement, even though it sounds like, it's not about judgment. In my mind, it's really a lot about thinking about what are we trying to do and how would we know if we got there. right? And so in that sense, it becomes a fun thing to be doing, that kind of critical thinking together, like we've had the opportunity to do today, rather than thinking, oh my God, measurements, indicators. And I just think it's it's really part of the journey that we feel that we've been on, is first to think through what is this, and then to try and apply it, and now to try and think about, what it looks like. And we've had such a great opportunity to look at the programs across the world and how I'm looking at the Plan International folks here, and the inspiration from some of the measurement that has been done in the international context, because I think they're way ahead of us in doing gender transformative work and in evaluating it. And,
absolutely, and it hasn't been said today or said enough, but it's of continuing interest to me that the so-called more developed countries are the last on this bandwagon of GT work. I think that's something for all of us to ruminate about. But I guess just want to put in one final plug for the concreteness that some of this can capture. For example, access to resources is kind of a big thing, but you can break that down. Who eats last at a table? Who eats the least in a family? These are measurable things, and they are being measured in international contexts. And the results are, fairly predictable, but I think these are pretty concrete measures. Access to food, access to water. Who carries water? How far?
Well, we have them here also, if you move into whose name is on the ownership of a car, family only has one car, who gets to use it. But we have lots of different ways of doing resources in the workplace as well on that. Well, thank you very much for having that conversation and answering some questions for us today. We are going to move on to having group discussion, and Nancy and Lorraine are going to help facilitate this for us. So would you like me to just pass it on to you, and you can do the setup? Or?
Yeah. How are we going to do the setup?
So that I can help put that segue into things. So we're going to have 4 discussion groups going concurrently, and so I'd like you